Good morning, Mercy View. My name is Ellen. I'm a partner here, and this morning I will be reading from 1 Samuel chapter 20, verses 1 through 17. These verses can be found on page 139 in these blue Bibles under your chairs. If you do not have a Bible, please feel free to take one. It is our gift to you. 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 1. Then David fled from Naioth in Ramah and came and said before Jonathan, "What have I done? What is my guilt? And what is my sin before your father that he seeks my life?" And he said to him, "Far from it. You shall not die. Behold, my father does nothing, either great or small, without disclosing it to me. And why should my father hide this from me? It is not so." But David vowed again, saying, "Your father knows well that I have found favor in your eyes. And he thinks, 'Do not let Jonathan know this, lest he be grieved.' But truly as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, there is but a step between me and death." Then Jonathan said to David, "Whatever you say, I will do for you." David said to Jonathan, "Behold, tomorrow is the new moon, and I should not fail to sit at the table with the king. But let me go, that I may hide myself in the field till the third day at evening. If your father misses me at all, then say, 'David earnestly asked leave of me to run to Bethlehem, his city, for there is a yearly sacrifice there for all the clan.' If he says, 'Good,' it will be well with your servant. But if he is angry, then know that harm is determined by him. Therefore, deal kindly with your servant, for you have brought your servant into a covenant of the Lord with you. But if there is guilt in me, kill me yourself, for why should you bring me to your father?" And Jonathan said, "Far be it from you. If I knew that it was determined by my father that harm should come to you, would I not tell you?" Then David said to Jonathan, "Who will tell me if your father answers you roughly?" And Jonathan said to David, "Come, let us go out into the field." So they both went out into the field. And Jonathan said to David, "The Lord, the God of Israel, be witness. When I have sounded out my father about this time tomorrow, or the third day, behold, if he is well disposed toward David, shall I not then send and disclose it to you? Should it please my father to do you harm, the Lord do so to Jonathan, and more also, if I do not disclose it to you and send you away, that you may go in safety. May the Lord be with you as he has been with my father. If I am still alive, show me the steadfast love of the Lord, that I may not die. And do not cut off your steadfast love from my house forever, when the Lord cuts off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth." And Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, "May the Lord take vengeance on David's enemies." And Jonathan made David swear again by his love for him, for he loved him as he loved his own soul. This is the word of the Lord.
Good to see you. Good morning. On a cold Sunday morning, thank you for braving the weather to come to church this morning. Before we get started, I actually don't see him in here, but major props to Pastor Sean on getting the sidewalks ready for you to walk on out here. So if you see him later, just give him a little thank you. I know that'd go a long way. He got out here early to get that ready for us this morning. And thank you to Trey and everybody that was here this morning getting ready for the service today. We're glad to be together with you, even though it's for some it's difficult to get out. My name is Brad. If I haven't introduced myself to you yet, I'm one of the pastors here, and this morning excited to be with you to walk through another portion of 1 Samuel with you. You know, there are moments in life when the relationships that we trust the most, the ones that are meant to provide stability, meant to provide peace, a foundation really for us, can suddenly crumble. And for me, one of those moments happened for me in my mid-20s when I realized that my parents were actually going to get divorced. After 30 years of marriage, that wasn't in my, on my bingo card at all. I wasn't really ready for that. I can say that there were things that I saw that in some ways made it a little less shocking. But I'll never forget Holly and I sitting in my childhood living room where I had so many great times together as a family. I can think of Christmases in particular that we shared there. In that same living room, my parents telling Holly and I, who are newly married, by the way, that they were going to go their separate ways. I don't really care how old you are. That kind of a conversation will gut you. And we tried everything, even after they told us that, to try to keep them together, to reconsider. But in the end, they chose another direction. And it was horrible. And can I be honest with you this morning? It still is, actually. Now, I'm not sure I would have known what to call that then, but I remember feeling something bubbling up inside of me once the decision was final. Like, it wasn't just sadness, it wasn't just confusion, those were in the mix, but it was something deeper inside of me that was really demanding something. I knew, again, I'm not sure I would have known how to say it then, but I was demanding justice because I felt betrayed. It was a feeling that I knew that something wasn't right, that something precious, marriages are precious, that something precious had been carelessly broken, and it needed to be addressed. I just didn't know how to address it. I knew something hurt inside of me, but I also knew it wasn't just the pain of loss, but it was the ache of something wrong on a larger scale. And I wonder if you have ever felt that way. Maybe you feel that way today. And if you have felt it or are feeling it even today, what do we do with that kind of disappointment? What do we do with that kind of heartbreak? Or maybe we could say it this way: what do you do with that kind of anger? Today, we are continuing our series in the book of 1 Samuel, a series called In Search of a King. And today, we will be in the 20th chapter of this great book. And as we do that today, I want to invite you to see two things. If you're taking notes, you can write this down. First is this: sinful anger fuels deception towards the truth and justice. Sinful anger fuels deception towards the truth and towards justice. Whereas, second, this is the second point, righteous anger fuels faithfulness to the truth and to justice. So, if you have your Bibles or electronic devices, keep them open there to 1 Samuel 20. And let me just remind you where we're at in our story. Last week, we saw this escalating conflict between Saul and David, right? Saul's jealousy is morphing now into an outright attempt on David's life, multiple attempts on his life. And despite Saul's schemes, which we've seen range from open threats to actual plots to kill him, God repeatedly delivered David last week. And what we saw in Technicolor last week was the stark contrast between David's dependence on God and Saul's defiant self-destruction. And here was our conclusion last week: God protects the humble, but He denies the persistently defiant. This really brings us to 1 Samuel 20 today. And as we do this, we're going to continue to see this theme that God delivers those who are dependent on Him, but He denies or hands over the willfully rebellious to their own ruin. So look with me, if you would, at verses 1 through 9. I'm not going to read all that again. You heard Ellen read that, but be ready to look at some things in that passage as we start here this morning. In fact, look right at the very beginning of verse 1, if you would. Here's what we see. We find, as we saw last week, David is running again. And we find that he is moving toward the only man outside of Samuel who can help him make sense of his situation. The man who he's cut a covenant with, a covenant of friendship with, back in 1 Samuel 18. None other than the son of Saul, the one who is running after him, Jonathan. And in our passage, when he finds Jonathan, he asks Jonathan 3 questions. Look there at verse 1. He says, "What first have I done? Second, what is my guilt?" And really a very similar question. Third, what is my sin before your father that seeks my life? David would have every right to be cynical here and like about Saul. He's actually attempted to kill him already. But even in this moment, I want you to notice David wants to know from Saul's son, Jonathan, if he has truly wronged his father. That's interesting, right? He does not assume, even in this moment, his own innocence. But just because Saul is acting unjustly, he wants to hear from his friend Jonathan. It's amazing. Now look at Jonathan's response in verse 2. On some level here, it seems that Jonathan is still living under the understanding, maybe we could even say the illusion, that his father is rational. And so, if you notice, he dismisses, in a way, the claim that David makes outright. He's thinking, how could this be? How could my dad be this way? Well, I think we get a clue, actually, in verse 3 of why David would ask these questions. I believe that Jonathan is still underestimating Saul at this point. David rightly points out in verse 3 that Saul has likely stopped talking to his son Jonathan about his intentions with David. So, obviously, Jonathan on some level would be in the dark. Is that fair? Okay, so that's why maybe Jonathan still has this sort of feeling about his dad at this point. And so David presses the matter. Look there, he lets us in on the stark reality that he believes that he is facing there at the end of verse 3, where he says this, "There is but a step between me and death." Now, Jonathan may not be convinced of Saul's scheme yet, even in this moment, but he can't deny David's desperation here either. So, he agrees, even in spite of maybe what he might be in the dark on, to help David. And so, David makes a plan to test Saul's intention. Look there at verse 5. There is a feast that's coming up, and at this feast, Saul's officials would be expected to be there. One of those people would be David. He would be expected to be there. But instead, David's plan is, I'm going to hide. Like, I'm not going to come to the feast. I'm going to hide. And when Saul notices, and he asks you, Jonathan, what's going on, I want you to tell your dad that I'm with my family in Bethlehem. And here is the test. If Saul doesn't react to David's absence, then maybe there's no danger. Jonathan can be reassured. Maybe my dad is really not after David. But if he gets angry, then Jonathan will see for himself what David already knows. And that is, Saul wants David dead. Now look with me at the end of verse 8. Notice what David says to Jonathan after walking through this test with him. He essentially looks at Jonathan and says that if within this test his father Saul can actually prove to him that David is guilty, he basically says this, if I'm guilty, this is David speaking to Jonathan, if I'm guilty, Jonathan, you can kill me yourself. Now don't miss this. David is saying that he would rather let his friend be the one that brings justice to him than to be handed over to his corrupt father. Here's what's at the forefront of David's mind. He wants the truth to be known. He doesn't want blind allegiance from Jonathan. And Jonathan's response in verse 9 is immediate. He says, "Far be it from you." This is his way of saying, like, the very idea, David, that you could be guilty of any crime worthy of death is unthinkable to me. But even with Jonathan's loyalty here in this moment, there is a lingering question for David. Look there at verse 10. He says it this way: "Who will tell me if your father answers you roughly?" In other words, if your dad reacts angrily that I'm not at this feast, how am I actually going to hear about it before it's too late? And he knows that if Saul's anger is provoked, he's seen it in person himself, that it can turn deadly in an instant. And so he knows that Jonathan, in this moment, has to decide, will he entertain his father's falsehoods, or will he risk everything to stand with his friend David? So, look with me at the beginning of verse 11. Jonathan actually invites further conversation. He invites David to the field to have a private conversation. And you may remember actually back in 1 Samuel 18, Jonathan and David bound themselves together in a covenant relationship, a friendship. And here, Jonathan is desiring to deepen that covenant. And you see it in a few ways here. In verse 13, he makes an oath, which is an appeal to the Lord, that if he does not do as he's promised to David, that God himself can bring divine judgment on him. He is invoking God's name as the ultimate witness and judge of his promise to David. No small thing. And part of this covenant or oath, there down in verse 16, notice is with the house of David. That's a significant phrase. This means that Jonathan is not just entering into a binding agreement with David alone. He's entering into a binding agreement with David's entire lineage, like his future dynasty. In other words, he's making a commitment to David's family, his lineage, even beyond maybe his and David's lifetimes. And he'll say it again down in verse 23, but notice what it says in verse 14. Look there. This is what it says: "Jonathan made David swear again by his love for him, for he loved him as he loved his own soul." We're going to talk about that a little bit more here in just a moment, but I just want to say this real quick here. Jonathan loved David. He once again, though, in this moment is compelling David to swear by that same deep sacrificial covenant love back to him. That's what that means there. Now look with me, if you would, at verses 18 through 23. Jonathan actually continues here to build out he and David's strategy to test his father, Saul. Look there. He tells David that, "I want you to hide for 3 days while I examine my father's disposition." And the reason why it's 3 days is because the feast was 3 days. It's a 3-day feast. And so Jonathan very shrewdly is thinking, like, you know, David, if you're not there the first day, my father may not really care about that. He may not even notice that. I think he would have noticed that. But he may not be angry on the first day. But if you're not there on the second day, we might begin to see a little bit more of Saul's true intentions. And if you're gone on the third day, we'll for sure know exactly where Saul stands. And so Jonathan builds out the strategy that David actually started building out earlier and says, "I want you to hide for all 3 days while I try to figure out what's going on with my dad." And then notice this: to secretly communicate the outcome to David, Jonathan says this to him in verse 20. Let me just read it. "I will shoot 3 arrows, and if I tell the boy they're beyond you, you got to run. You got to get out of here. But if I say they're closer, you can know that you're safe." So David does this. David hides himself in the field, and the feast comes, the 3-day feast. On day 1, Jonathan sits at the king's table, and David's spot's empty, and nothing is said. So on the second day, we haven't even gotten to the third day. On the second day, David's spot remains empty, and Saul notices, and I think his suspicion is starting to grow. So he asks Jonathan in verse 27, "What's going on?" And Jonathan tells his father what he and David agreed to say back in verse 6. David is back with his family in Bethlehem. Now, in a moment, you see this. Saul's anger erupts in verse 30. There is no slow climb to frustration and anger. He goes from 0 to 100. He accuses Jonathan of betraying his family. He basically tells Jonathan that he is dead to him. And then he asks for David to be brought to him, so that he can kill David once and for all. So look there at verse 32. Jonathan asks his father what David had done. And here's what he says in verse 32. Let me just read that. He says, "Why should he be put to death? What has he done?" Remember what David is after? Remember what Jonathan is after? The truth, right? This is the moment of truth. And boy, does Saul let his intention be known. Instead of responding to his son with his words, he throws a spear at his son. Now, the spear has been this recurring symbol of Saul's jealousy, his anger, and honestly, at this point, I think we could say his madness. And in this moment, when Saul's spear is thrown at his son Jonathan, the truth of his father's heart comes out in the open once and for all. So, it says there in verse 34, notice this, that Jonathan angrily gets up from the table and begins to leave. And he had seen his father for who he really was now, and I think that is the maybe lesser issue here, but that is an important one. The bigger issue is that his heart is grieved, I believe, for his friend David. In other words, in this moment, Jonathan is gutted by the injustice that his innocent friend was facing from his father. Yes, he was hurt by his father's actions deeply. But his heart broke more for the injustice done to someone who had shown him nothing but loyalty and love. Now, a couple weeks ago, we took a deep dive into the idea of jealousy, because that's what we saw in our story with Saul. We saw that the effects of unchecked jealousy corrupts relationships. It drives people to do things that are irrational, like it has for Saul against David. And though we would not call it, we're not trying to murder people, we are doing a version of that in our hearts towards others if we are allowing jealousy to go unchecked in our hearts. And last week we saw this jealousy that Saul has turn from foolishness, really, to a death warrant for David, a literal death warrant. And this week we are seeing that Saul's dishonor and his jealousy has now overflowed into anger that is overpowering him. In other words, Saul's anger is no longer just a personal vendetta against David. It's expanding. It is now a full-blown rage that is willing to destroy everything and anything in its path, even if it includes his own son, Jonathan. Now, so jealousy may have fueled Saul in the past couple of weeks. But now we see that anger is blinding him from reason and the very relationships that should matter most to him. And that brings me to the first thing I want you to see this morning. Sinful anger fuels deception towards the truth and justice. Do we not see that clearly in the life of Saul here and what we just looked at? His unbridled anger toward David brought him to a place of absolute irrationality. His perception of reality at this point is so warped that he not only is seeking to kill an innocent man, but he's also seeking to harm his own kin. This is what sinful anger can do in our lives. And we see it in a couple of ways here in our story with Saul. First, this is how I would say it. Sinful anger distorts the truth. See, when we let anger, sinful anger, take root in our hearts, it begins to cloud our vision. Saul was so consumed by his anger that he began to see David as a threat that must be eliminated even when there was no rational basis for it. We can do the same. Like when we allow ourselves to see situations through a filter of resentment, or at worst, hatred, and we end up then, what can happen is we very easily can justify our sinful feelings. We feel justified in feeling that way. Sinful anger distorts the truth. But second, sinful anger also distorts justice. Let me tell you what I mean by that. It can make us think that we have the right to, in some way, punish others for perceived wrongs, regardless of the actual guilt that may be in the mix. Saul, in his fury, was so blinded by his anger, he sought to kill 2 innocent men. What would that be if that happened in our story today? That would be an injustice. And we can do the same. Again, maybe it's more subtle, it's in our hearts, but instead of seeking true justice, we can allow our anger sinfully to so dictate our actions that we commit injustices of the heart, of our own making, and sometimes those can bleed out into real life. So I wonder if you see how dangerous this kind of anger can be. It doesn't just kind of flare up and then fade away. Like if you have a problem with anger, you know this, it keeps coming back. And sometimes it scares you when it comes back, if you're honest, about just how angry you are. And if you let it fester like it has festered for Saul, listen, it will distort you. I wonder if you've ever seen those funhouse mirrors. You know what I'm talking about? So like growing up in the little city I grew up in, every summer the city fair would come through. It was uptown. And there was this like really corny haunted house on a flatbed. It was perfect for little kids. It wasn't that scary. But the very first thing in that haunted house was a funhouse mirror. And I loved it. But I remember thinking every time I would walk in front of it, the way that it would stretch and shrink and twist my reflection was weird. Like I looked weird in the mirror, you know. Honestly, I couldn't recognize myself in the mirror. That's what sinful anger does to you, to me. It warps your perception of reality. You can find yourself in a place where you look at yourself in a normal mirror and go, what has happened to me? What's going on with me? So let me ask you this. Are you currently so angry at someone that you have assumed the worst about them, even though you don't have all the info that you need? Have you nursed bitterness? Are you nursing bitterness? In such a way that you're rewriting history in your own mind and turning people who were once friends to you into villains? Are you letting your anger convince you that you are justified in your feelings, sinful feelings? Are you so bent on proving you're right on something that you've lost sight of God's call to pursue peace and reconciliation? If you were honest, if your anger is causing you to act in ways that you know are out of character for yourself, you would say, it's a funhouse mirror version of me. See, the terrifying part about Saul in our story, and we've seen this over the last few weeks, is that he thinks he is justified to feel the way he feels. That's the danger of sinful anger. It makes you believe that your wrath, your anger is, listen, reasonable. Sinful anger fuels deception toward the truth and justice. Now, I don't want you to miss another kind of anger in our passage today, though. I wonder if you saw it. Look back with me, if you would, at verse 34. Verse 34 of 1 Samuel 20. Do you remember how Jonathan reacted to his father whenever Saul showed his true colors to him at the feast? Let's look at it again. Here's what it says. It says that Jonathan rose from the table. This is verse 34. What? Anger. Now, what kind of anger was that? Was that sinful anger or something else? Because some of you have just heard what I said, and you would say to me, like, Brad, I am angry, but I have searched my heart, and I just don't see anything that is necessarily prompting that is sinful. I have anger over a real injustice, Brad, in my life. Like, my pride isn't wounded. That's not the issue, Brad. My anger is about something that I believe is truly wrong. Well, there is another kind of anger. And we see it in our story today in Jonathan. And it's something called, listen, righteous anger. Now, what is that? Well, righteous anger is the kind of anger that burns against real sin and real injustice. It's the kind that actually reflects God's own anger towards evil. I think that's what we see in our story with Jonathan today. His anger was not selfish. It was sincere. I would argue it was sanctified. Why? Because his father was acting wickedly. And that brings me to the second thing I want you to see this morning. Righteous anger fuels faithfulness to the truth and to justice. Let me just say that again. Righteous anger fuels faithfulness to the truth and justice. See, the key here is to ensure that you are angry for the right reasons and in the right way. I don't know if you've ever heard a sermon preached about anger, but we're getting ready to do it, righteous anger. We're getting ready to do it, all right? Everybody all right? All right. Well, let's start by saying this. When you are trying to determine, do I have sinful anger on this issue or do I have righteous anger on this issue? First, you have to examine the evidence. Is there any real violation of God's law here? Or another way we could say it is, are you defending God's glory and truth in your anger? Are you seeking God's righteousness in that situation? Is your frustration prompted by someone's unrepentant sin against God? Or are you reacting to a perceived wrong? Like it's perception, not reality. Are you merely defending your own reputation and maybe preference? Is it a reaction based on your own pride, your own ego maybe? See, what Jonathan rose in fierce anger against when he did this with Saul, it wasn't primarily because his pride was wounded. It was wounded. His father wounded him deeply. But it was because his father, his dad, had chosen wickedness over righteousness. He had chosen injustice over justice. So righteous anger is about being angry about the same kind of things that God is. It's being angry about the desecration of what is holy. It is about the oppression of the innocent. It is about the trampling of the truth. See, righteous anger is ignited by things that, listen, anger God. So, do you know your Bibles well enough to know what those things are? Like, how would you know that to make this distinction, how would you know that you have righteous anger versus sinful anger? Well, here's a short list. Things like true injustice, the betrayal of trust, the perversion of what is good, the suppression of truth. Those are some of the things that righteous anger is meant, listen, to burn against. If your anger doesn't reflect those concerns, it is worth taking a step back and asking yourself, is my anger truly righteous? Or is it just self-serving? If your anger is primarily about how you've been wronged, rather than how God's truth has been wronged, it may not be righteous anger. Now that's sort of like the right reasons. Like we got to know, like being angry for the right reasons. But we also have to know how to do righteous anger in the right way as well. Like even if your anger is just, it has to be wielded rightly. In James 1, we're actually commanded to be slow to anger. Like it doesn't lash out like Saul does, goes 0 to 100 in a moment, but it moves with wisdom. It moves with purpose. Jonathan did not throw his own spear in retaliation to his dad. What his anger instead drove him to do was to protect his friend David. Righteous anger should fuel action. Many times it does. But that action must be just. It must be measured. And it must be directed by love for God and neighbor. It should lead us to pray for God's justice. Not like our version of it, but God's justice. Not like just wanting our frustrations to be vented. It should lead us to speak truth boldly, yes. But not to indulge in self-righteous tirades. It should drive us to defend the innocent, to uphold righteousness, not to just become embittered people. And as Ephesians 4:26 warns us, even righteous anger must not fester. It says, don't let the sun go down in your anger. The principle there is your anger must be dealt with before it turns into something destructive. Like manna, righteous anger rots if it's stored overnight. It must be put to use in the right way in pursuit of justice. Or, this is what's hard about this too, and we're going to touch on this here at the very end, but sometimes you just have to lay it at the feet of Jesus. Because you're not going to see that justice in this lifetime. The measure of righteous anger is not just that it's right in its object, but that it's right in its execution. In short, we are called to reflect the righteous anger of God, which is always just, always purposeful, and always tempered with, listen to this, mercy. Righteous anger fuels faithfulness to the truth and justice. This brings me to the end of our story today. Look with me if you would, beginning there in verse 35. Jonathan arrives in the field to carry out their plan with the arrows. Remember the arrow plan, right? So the first arrow flies beyond the boy, and so Jonathan yells, "The arrow is beyond you." And in that moment, David understands that Saul's intent was clear. He wants him dead. Now, what happens next is raw and real. Look there at verse 41. David emerges from his hiding place, and these two friends, bound by a covenant deeper than blood, began to weep together. And notice that it says that David, the writer wants you to know that David wept the most. An interesting detail, right? See, David knew what Jonathan had done for him. He had risked his life to save him. And the tears flowed. That's real emotion. And as they stand there, the tears of goodbye, which were bitter in a lot of ways, they're getting ready to say goodbye to each other, are mixed with a word of eternal hope. Look there at verse 42. Jonathan reaffirms his covenant once again to David, even beyond his lifetime. And just like that, this chapter marks the end of most of what we're going to hear about the man Jonathan. Jonathan is like the anti-Cain or the anti-Esau, because Jonathan was willing to give up his position for David's rightful future. And in one final selfless moment, Jonathan places the future of the kingdom into his friend David's hands. Now, I'm just going to do a little sidebar here. This is not the theme of the passage, but we need to talk briefly about what we see happening here at the end of 1 Samuel 20 between Jonathan and David. If you remember a few weeks ago, back at the beginning of 1 Samuel 18, we saw for the first time this deep bond of friendship between Jonathan and David form when they made a covenant with each other. And we said that contrary to modern interpretations that would attempt to romanticize their relationship, the Bible clearly is presenting their relationship as a deep, committed friendship between two men, grounded in mutual respect and aligned with biblical principles. And today we come to another passage that some would use to further that idea, that in some way the relationship between Jonathan and David was more than fraternal. You'll notice that in verse 41 that not only did David and Jonathan weep together, it says that they kissed one another. We got to deal with that briefly here. The kiss between Jonathan and David in that verse should be understood in the cultural context of ancient Israel. This particular expression was common among close friends. Think of it as our handshake or hug. It was not a symbol of romantic desire. It was an expression of brotherly love. And to suggest otherwise, as we said a few weeks ago, is to try to justify or normalize behaviors that are still and have always been contrary to biblical teaching. All right, we're back here. Sidebar's over. Here we go. I want to end here. In 1 Samuel 20, we see really two faces of anger, right? We see Saul's sinful anger that warps and blinds him to the truth and to justice. But we also see Jonathan's righteous indignation that seeks what is right and what is holy. So it is important for us this morning to check our hearts to see if we have anger of some kind, or when we reflect and think of the anger we have had, is that righteous anger or is it sinful anger? That's good. But I wasn't prepared to say this at all, but as we were singing Son of Suffering this morning, I realized that some of you this morning are dealing with very real righteous anger. You are experiencing the very real suffering and grief that is associated with that. And you need to hear this morning as a means of encouragement. Isaiah 53, beginning in verse 3, says this. This is a prophecy about Jesus. He was despised and rejected by men, and listen to this phrase, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has taken on our griefs, and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace. And with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed, and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. And then down in verse 10, it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. When his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. Listen to this, out of the anguish of his soul, he shall see and be satisfied. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous. And he shall bear their iniquities. I shared a very personal story at the top of our time this morning, because the reality is I'm not sure on this side of eternity I'm going to see a whole lot of justice come from that. Most of what I experience as a part of that, being a part of my story, is hurt and confusion, and disappointment, and I hope at this point in my life, righteous anger. Now, God is not beyond bringing redemption and restoration and reconciliation between people. I have a good relationship with my parents. But it's not the same, right? But here's what I know. The man of sorrows is near to me. And the man of sorrows can be near to you, even on this side of eternity, in the midst of what you feel is righteous anger about something in your life. And we want to pray that God, again, would bring redemption, reconciliation, restoration to you. But the reality is that doesn't always happen. So what helps us in the waiting? The man of sorrows. And I love how this passage ends in Isaiah 53. You know, Jesus, what he did for us, in part, was to make us righteous. Right? And Christ's call to us to uphold righteous anger in a way that honors him can only be done if you have been made righteous. Righteous anger is impossible for someone who hasn't been made righteous. So some of you here this morning are like, man, I am actually really angry. And I don't see a way out of it. I do not see a light at the end of the tunnel, Brad. Let me just say to you, your first issue this morning isn't about making whatever situation that is right. It's about getting right with God. So if you're here this morning and you don't know Jesus, here in just a moment, a prayer team will be here to my left. They would love to talk to you about what it means to get your life right with God first. And the man of sorrows wants to come near to you in your grief and your sorrow and begin to bring hope and healing to you. That comes first and foremost with a relationship with God. Now, for most of us here this morning, we've already made that decision. You have been made righteous, but you are not acting in your anger righteously. And so, God has made you righteous through his grace and mercy so that you can pursue righteous truth, righteous justice. You can even have an anger that is righteous. But righteous anger flows from hearts made righteous by the grace of God. Do you know the grace of God this morning? in such a way that you can have the right kind of anger that flows from a heart that's been made righteous by His mercy, by the man of sorrows. Once God makes us righteous, through His grace, through His mercy, we then can pursue righteous truth and righteous justice, not just as individuals, but actually as a church as well. Because honestly, sinful anger is what blinds us to truth and justifies our bitterness. It is the kind of stuff that turns small grievances into mountains and fuels division instead of unity in a church body. So we actually, as a church, as righteous people, need to reject that kind of negativity, division, and turning small things into big things. Because if we don't, it is going to distort our perception of others here, and it will hinder the peace that Christ has called us to uphold, that He, listen, frankly, that He died for. God's anger, His wrath against sin poured out on Christ on the cross is the very means by which we've been made righteous, and it is the very thing that helps us as we relate to one another and as we relate to God, have the right kind of anger. It's called righteous anger. It's the kind of anger that, if rightly used, will bring about truth and justice in our world in the way that God would intend. Let's pray together.